So you want to be a dungeon master. You are tired of watching Critical Role and Dimension 20 and Acquisitions Inc. and watching other people have these amazing times. You want to get together your own group of friends and don the mantle of dungeon master and get this thing going. First of all, I really want to thank you. The world needs more Dungeons Masters. Thank you for taking a swing at this. And what I hope today is to give you some really good practical tips, some mindset tips to help you be the best you can be going into this so that hopefully you can keep going at it and have a glorious future of mini games and mini campaigns and many thrilled players, most of all you. The first piece of advice I'm going to give you, some mindset advice. This is piece of advice zero, if you will, is that this game, Dungeons and Dragons, is fun all by itself. You don't need to be at your best or the best. You don't need to have the best players. You don't need to have the absolute best circumstance to have a great, fun game of Dungeons and Dragons. There is something magical about this game. The act of sitting around a table with a bunch of people, taking on imaginary roles, rolling these funny looking dice and adding numbers to figure out what does and doesn't happen, the randomness of it, the anticipation of it, the social interaction aspect mixed with the teamwork aspect, mixed with the tactics and the storytelling. It's a great game. And if you can get a group of people willing to sit down and play it with you, it can be very, very fun long before any of you at the table consider yourselves good at it. So that's the good news. And with that news, I just want you to relax a bit, because if anybody is going to screw this up, it's going to be you getting in your own way. And there's two things that you'll do as a beginning dungeon master, and even an experienced dungeon master, that are gonna mess with the inherent funness of this game, and that is taking things too seriously, and the other thing is overcomplicating things. So today, again, going to give you some really good advice on how not to do that, as well as some other things. I'm really excited for you. I hope you have an amazing first game, or maybe if you're already moving along the track and you've played several games, I hope I can give you some really good advice today to help you level up as you move along your journey as a dungeon master. Probably the most basic and important piece of advice I can give you is that before you try to be a dungeon master, play the game of Dungeons and Dragons. Every time I hear someone talking about how they're about to start their first campaign and they have no experience, not just as a dungeon master, but have never played the game before, I just think to myself, my God, this poor person is about to potentially have such a bad experience that it might completely put them off of the game of Dungeons and Dragons, maybe for the rest of their lives, and that would be a shame. And it could all be prevented if they could just play even a couple sessions with a decent dungeon master first. Dungeon mastering is this very nuanced craft. There's a lot of layers to it, a lot going on, and you as a dungeon master are actually playing and managing many different games when you're playing the game of Dungeons and Dragons. And there is a level of understanding that is hard to put into writing, that is hard to put into speech. It's something you need to experience, and dungeon mastering very much is an experiential craft. Now, there have been tons of books and things written and said about how to be a better dungeon master, and here I am every week adding my 2 cents to the pile. But nothing is going to prepare you and improve you to begin dungeon mastering like actually experiencing playing the game at another dungeon master's table. When I think of the craft of dungeon mastering, I almost think of the old storyteller traditions and even shamanic traditions of different cultures around the world. For instance, the Celts have their bards, and they are able to take these incredibly complicated folk tales and legends and knowledge about herbs and remedies for different ailments, very complicated stuff, rituals, and pass it down to the next generation and flawlessly. And they don't do that by handing the next generation a pile of books. They do it experientially by being an example. And while there's certainly tons written about dungeon mastering, really you need to be there at the feet of a master to really absorb that DMness, whatever it is. It's going to help you hugely. Not only that, but you're going to be able to experience the player perspective. And being a player in the game, understanding what it's like to be a player is so important to being a good DM. That's really going to help you. Thirdly, being a player is going to allow you to be in a game in an atmosphere where you're not expected to know all the rules. You're there to learn them. And learning those rules is going to be very important for you for your first game running smoothly. You certainly don't have to know all the rules. I don't know all the rules and proper procedures for things. But you do have to have a grasp on certain things, and spending time as a player is going to help you get there. I would love for you to spend years as a player. I would love for you to play multiple campaigns with different characters to really get this broad kind of experience of what it's like to play. But you might not have the time or the desire to do that. You might just want to get started right now. If you do, again, even just playing a few games is going to make a world of difference for your first session as a dungeon master. Just having a few games under your belt as a player is going to make you so much better, I can guarantee you. You may be in a position where none of your friends want to don the mantle of dungeon master, and that's why you've signed up for this in the first place with total lack of experience. You can look up your local game shops. They often have a game night where they have volunteer dungeon masters come in, open tables where you can just sign up to get a seat. Sometimes, you have to kick in $5 or $10 to play at one of those games, but that's a great way to play in person. Online, you can go to places like Roll20 and often just sign up for a membership, and then you can search and find a lot of free games on there. That's a good place to start. You can go to Start Playing, where some of my games are, and you can often find some really good dungeon masters running free tutorials or running, inexpensive campaigns. If a campaign is too much to commit to, you can play some one-shots. You can find stuff like that on there as well. And you can read those reviews to kind of make sure you're getting a quality person that's good at the craft. Whatever you do, get some games under your belt as a player before you play. Super, super important, guys. Earlier, I talked to you about the two major ways you're going to get in your own way as a new dungeon master. One of those being taking things too seriously, the other being overcomplicating things. This, my next piece of advice, is going to play into both of those, really. And my next piece of advice, do not world build. Okay? Now, I know that a lot of us were drawn to Dungeons and Dragons because we are enchanted by the idea of creating our own world. We think things like, what would the world of how cool would it be to run a campaign like Westeros with this political intrigue and these characters that are very dynamic and gray, but maybe add more magic to it and draw our own map and our own locations. We think, what would the Forgotten Realms be like if Bane returned to the pantheon of gods and stole the powers of the god of death and raised all the dead from the graveyards of Toril, unleashing this undead apocalypse on the world, leaving vast stretches of the Forgotten Realms filled with these crumbling cities with shuffling undead, a zombie apocalypse. We think of all kinds of things like that. Lots of us, again, we're drawn to dungeon mastering because of that. It's one of the big appeals to us. Um, Hear me out. Hear me out. World building is an entire craft. Dungeon mastering is an entire craft. I would really suggest that you take on dungeon mastering in its own right as one thing before you try and add world building on top of your plate. Another reason why I would avoid world building as you are a beginning dungeon master is that you're probably going to be playing with a lot of beginner players, and adding a whole bunch of very story specific aspects to your game that the characters don't have, that the players rather don't have any frame of reference for, because it's all new, it's all stuff that you created, is just going to really make it harder on them to learn the game. They're going to be tracking all this lore, all this information that's important. Maybe you want to create different mechanics for how the world affects people. You want to make the phases of the moon affect spell casting. You want to make some sort of undead miasma infect people, and they maybe have to make saving throws every month, or they start to become more undead. You want to have some kind of corruption mechanic. All this kind of world-related homebrew stuff. And homebrew itself, it just adds a layer of confusion for newer players and for you as a newer DM, when really what you should be doing is discovering the game of Dungeons and Dragons for what it is. It is a great game as is. And just sort of adding a bunch of complicated story elements and homebrew mechanics on top of it, the kind of things that come along with world building, are just going to make your job harder. This is definitely a bit of taking things too seriously, and it is definitely over complicating things. If you want to world build off to the side and save that stuff for your second campaign or your third campaign. But for your first campaign, create something simple, something really grounded in the game as is, so you can learn that and not put this whole other thing on your plate, this whole other burden of lore and complexity on your player's plate. And again, as a newer dungeon master, you're likely to have at least a few newer players, if not a complete table full of newer players. So it's great to have a pre-written world, something like Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Dragonlance, that you can just present to the players, and the lore is out there if they want to research it. The lore is out there if you want to research it. It just takes a huge burden off your back, a lot of headspace, a lot of processing power, which you're going to need to play your best beginner games as a beginner dungeon master. So, guys, for your first campaign, beginning dungeon master, please, please, please don't world build. Or if you do it off to the side, save it for the next campaign. Okay, let's pretend you guys are going to listen to my advice about not world building. Let's pretend you're not going to go down that rabbit hole for your first D&D campaign, and I really hope you don't. So if I don't want you to world build, what would I have you build? Well, I would rather have you not have to build anything. You're just learning the game. You're learning the rules. You're learning how to be a dungeon master. I think the best favor you could do yourself is buy a pre-written module, find a pre-written module that appeals to you, and run that pretty much as written. If you want to dip your toe and change some things around, go for it. but really just try and experience the game as intended so that you can just learn the basics of presenting the encounters, running the encounters, interacting with your players, and just holding down that chair of dungeon master and not having to worry about a bunch of stuff you've changed, created, and wondering whether or not that's going to get your party, your players killed unfairly, or worried about whether or not that's going to make sense later on for the story. If you're going to build anything, or even as you are looking at pre-written adventurers, what a beginning dungeon master campaign, what I think it should really be focused around are two elements. You should have a town, preferably a small town, and a dungeon. Now, this is a very simple, old, tried and true method. The great Matt Colville himself many times has preached the virtues of the old first edition adventures, Village of Hamlet, and also Cult Against the Cult of the Reptile God. Both of those adventures feature a pretty fleshed out town, a map, different people, NPCs, locations, everything sort of fleshed out in this town that is near a dungeon, which is a threat to the town or needs to be explored. This is such a great format for a beginning dungeon master for several reasons. First of all, on the town side, there is a set number of NPCs that you're going to be able to learn and figure out, how you're going to portray them. You're not constantly having to make up new NPCs as the characters travel around from town to town. You can really settle in and focus on, I would say try to keep it to 5 or 6 really kind of important NPCs and have everything else sort of backgrounded. So if you have this set town that your first campaign is going to be centered around, it's going to allow newer players as well as experienced players to gain a sort of connection by continually interacting with the same group of NPCs, and it's going to allow you to sink into the shoes of those NPCs and get better and better by practicing with this, playing the same group of NPCs. Now, the dungeon part of it, I would really, really try and have a lot of your adventures, your first adventures for your campaign, your first campaign, I would really try and have a lot of those set in a dungeon. Now, Dungeons and Dragons works really well. Even this far down the line, even now we're in 5th edition and we're about to get a new edition of the game, the roots of this game, Dungeons and Dragons, maybe not necessarily, Chainmail, which was a war game, but as Dungeons and Dragons really came into its own with some of the first box sets, all of the adventures, everything was really built around dungeon crawls. And even all these years later and all these editions later, the game still functions. The rules still function with the most ease and the best application when you're in a dungeon. And playing the game in the way that it plays best is going to help you as a beginning dungeon master. Now, this is also going to be great for your players because, especially with beginning players, beginning players, they tend to really be into builds, and they're really curious about how are the things on my character sheet and the choices I've made, how is it going to actually translate into this game? Like, is the reaction I get with protection style, where I get to throw up my shield, is that actually going to be fun? Am I going to get to use it? Is my +2 for archery style? Like, am I going to notice that I'm hitting a lot more than the frontline fighter? What are my spells actually going to be like? Is Magic Missile going to be a cool spell? Is Sleep going to be awesome? Is Fog Cloud going to come in handy? Newer players and older players as well, they really want to use the stuff on your character sheet. And if you hit them with this campaign that's very travel oriented, very roleplay oriented, it's going to be D&D. But if you put this same group of players in a dungeon and you just give them lots of good old-fashioned monster fighting, Number one, it's going to give you lots of repetition with the rules. Number two, it's going to allow them to really dig into their character sheets as players and use their abilities. Roll to hit with that sword. Roll those dice. Swing that axe. Fire that bow. Players love that. And while role playing can be a little bit confusing and intimidating for newer players definitely tend to really enjoy fighting monsters and learning about that aspect of the game, I've found. And having those players in a dungeon, it gives you a lot of control over, the players are there in the dungeon. They're not going to surprise you by moving in a completely unexpected direction. It's going to make things easier on you and funner for your players as you are learning to DM. I really, really highly recommend that you find some good dungeon crawls that you can sort of center your campaign around, your first campaign, and start there. Spending a lot of time in dungeons is just going to be a great way for you and your players to further learn and master the combat rules, and it's just going to take a lot of the headache off of you. It's going to give you a break from role playing if that's something that if that's a muscle you haven't built up yet. It's going to give you a break from players making really odd decisions that throw your overarching plot line, off course. So, town, dungeon. I would really focus on that and keep the scope of that first adventure really small. And in that vein, definitely start at first level. You might have some players that try to talk you into starting at third level because that's when they get their cool stuff, or starting at second level so they have a few more hit points. If you're a beginning dungeon master, you are learning alongside your players. They might know more than you. You might have more to learn. So I would really start out with first level players because that's going to help you. Even the difference between what a first level character can do and a second level character can do is there's a significant learning curve there, especially if you are a beginning dungeon master. And so to play with first level characters, you're going to be able to really easily understand what each character can do and gauge things. So yeah, start at first level, small town with a few key NPCs so as not to put this pressure of roleplay on yourself, and then a dungeon crawl that allows your players to really get in there, hunt monsters, go on quests that really involve the combat. And this kind of touches on something that I think really helps for beginning dungeon masters and beginning players, which I would call player-centric play, as opposed to character-centric play. So what is that? I'm going to touch on that next. Next piece of advice for beginning dungeon masters is to embrace player-centric play versus character-centric play. Now, this is where a lot of people are going to disagree with me. I'm sure I'm going to get some nah. But I'm talking to beginning dungeon masters here. And I think as a beginning dungeon master, it's really important to take some burden off of yourself, to lighten your load, to not take things too seriously, as I said earlier, and to do that to allow you to learn and grow as you're starting to learn how to even do this thing. So what is player-centric play? Well, it's acknowledging the fact that there are players sitting at the table and that there is a game being played. In character-centric play, we tend to want to sort of ignore anything that pulls us out of the narrative. We want to talk in character as much as possible. We want to role play as much as possible. We don't want to just spew extra game speak and rule speak at the table. We want to kind of like try and really be in the story, and we want to create these really big stories. And that is something that makes D&D great. But in player-centric play, you really just kind of, you let your guard down and you just acknowledge the fact that, like, okay, you're players sitting at the table. especially if some of them are new, they've they haven't learned how to role play maybe yet. They haven't learned how to put themselves in the place of a player. And they're there playing a game. They feel like they're there playing a game. They feel like a player, not like their character. And so as a player, they're looking at their character sheet and they want to know what the stuff means. They want to know what it can do. And if they are being asked to like role play dramatic moments, if they're being asked to come up with really complicated background stories and stuff like that for their first game, or that's gonna really hamper them. They're gonna have a hard time feeling comfortable as their character if they don't feel comfortable with the game as a player yet. And the same is true for you as a DM. You're gonna have a hard time storytelling and portraying your world when you don't feel comfortable with the game. And so having a kind of player oriented mindset just takes some of the burden off you. You just need to worry less about breaking the narrative. You want to explain rules as things are happening. Don't feel bad about kind of explaining, like, okay, the monster, he's going to move. The goblin, okay, 5, 10, 15, 20. Okay, he's flanking you, so I'm going to roll this roll with advantage. And just that kind of speech, a more narrative game might want to sort of curtail that and hold back on the gaminess of it. But that kind of stuff is really appreciated in a beginner game. It's going to help you learn the rules as a DM. It's going to help some of your less experienced players learn the rules. And also with with kind of the game mindset is just maybe more fights so that your players have more opportunities to use the stuff on their character sheets and to learn the combat rules. And don't be afraid about running a combat heavy campaign. Don't be afraid about talking about the rules, about admitting when you're wrong, about sort of sitting at the table and really playing it like it is a game, and you're all a bit stepped back and removed from your characters. When we see people like the folks on Critical Role, we see how into their characters get. It's like the rules and the dice begin to sort of lose their meaning, and some of the real pivotal moments in the story have to do with the character's emotions and decisions and reactions. And that is really top tier D&D, and you will get there, but you got to walk before you run. And don't feel like you have to foster that intense, really weighty kind of story heavy moment. That will start to happen as you and your players relax more, and you will relax more as you get a better grasp of the rules and what the game is and what your characters can do. And you'll get a better grasp of that by just being honest at the table that, like, hey, we're playing a game here and I don't know this rule, and wait, which die do I roll? And don't try to make it all dramatic and narrative and super story driven when you haven't even mastered the rules yet. Hopefully I'm getting this point across clearly. I know I'm rambling a bit here, but I think it really is an important tip. If you could gain something from what I'm saying here, I guess maybe another way to put it is that it's okay not to have this perfect role-playing experience if you're still learning the rules. You could just play it like a game. And it's perfectly okay for you as a dungeon master if you don't if you don't have your role-playing chops yet, or you feel a little embarrassed, you don't know if your voices are good yet. Perfectly okay for you to narrate your NPCs. Perfectly okay for you to say, the innkeep says he hasn't seen anyone in days. The barmaid whispers in your ear, she says, no, there were 4 riders that came in here just last night. I don't know why he would say that. It's perfectly okay for you to narrate if you don't have a voice for that NPC or you don't feel comfortable role-playing, just don't have those chops yet. And same thing for beginning players. So it's okay to play the game like a game. You don't have to go full immersion until you've kind of built up those chops and mastered the rules a little bit better. Okay, this next piece of advice might seem a little bit strange, but I think it's really important for new dungeon masters to hear it. Before I get into that, guys, if you like what I'm putting down so far, drop a like and a subscribe. And also, I would love to hear from dungeon masters who are watching this. If you have any good recommendations for dungeon crawls, especially 5e dungeon crawls, that would be really great for a first level party to sort of start and kind of pursue through, for 3 or 4 levels at least. Any good dungeon crawl recommendations for 5e? I would stay away from converting old stuff, because this is advice for new dungeon masters. We don't want to have them converting stuff right out the gate, although there's tons of old school stuff out there that's just amazing. Yeah, anything 5e that you guys think would be perfect for a new dungeon master to run. Now, this next piece of advice is for a new dungeon master. I would really coach you, I would really advise you to let the foolish decisions of players, let them have the appropriate consequences. Don't feel like it's your responsibility to save your characters from the bad decisions of the players. Please, please, please do not put that burden upon you. And from the get-go, I would love for you to understand that that's not your responsibility. It is not your responsibility, because when you play your first game of Dungeons and Dragons, when you first get into this, it's not going to take long before you experience your first jackass player. And it may be several jackass players all snickering, thrilled with the idea that in this game they can do whatever they want. Now, here's what I would do. Just let them do whatever they want and let them die. Probably the most go-to thing that every jackass player, when they come in, the thing that they're gonna think this is so creative and so unusual, they're gonna try and rob from a town person. They're gonna try and grab the innkeep by his collar and shake him around to get a free night's stay at the end. You're gonna run into players like that. And what you simply want to have off to the side is just the idea, and you want to kind of say to them, as they say, I grab them by the shirt tails and rough them up. You want to kind of be prepared. You're going to have a player eventually, and probably early on in your career, who tries to throw their weight around with the local townspeople. And what you need to say to that player at the table in front of everyone is like this. Okay, so you want to grab the bartender by his collars and threaten him to get free rooms. Yeah. Okay, so if you do that, that's tantamount to, assaulting someone. And the bartender might not say anything, but that could get you in trouble. There is a law in this town, and you could be getting yourself into trouble if you go down that route. Is that something you still want to do? Yeah, whatever. Yeah, And so you want to have that speech prepared. The other thing you want to have prepared is the local law enforcement. Now, there's nothing unrealistic about having a retired knight in the town as the sheriff, a veteran perhaps as his assistant, or maybe a bounty hunter that the knight can bring on when times of trouble, and then maybe 4 or 5 guards. And a knight, a veteran, 4 or 5 guards, they will absolutely wipe the floor with a first level party, a second level party, and maybe even a third level party. And you want to have those guys, and if that party or someone in the party continues to do bad behavior, you want those consequences to come. You don't necessarily have to kill their character. Be realistic about it. One approach is you could have, whoever strikes the downing blow on them. They do it non-lethal, put the character in chains, take everything they have, and kick them out of town. And anybody who comes to their defense for breaking the law, anybody who tries to fight that, to stop them from apprehending them or break them out of jail or whatever, they become part of the problem. And the law comes down on them. What you're gonna find is that there's two kinds of jackass players. One is just the guy who really wants to see if Dungeons and Dragons, if you really can do whatever you want, and they're kind of fascinated and they just want to see what happens. And if you actually reinforce consequences, if you actually bring down opponents that wipe the floor with them, as would happen in real life, if you do that, they are going to be thrilled. They're going to be like, oh my God. And they're going to shape up because they actually don't want their characters to die. They certainly don't want to have everything on their character sheet taken off to where they're just walking around in a tunic. They hate that. They do not want that to happen again. They're going to take note and be like, oh man. And you are going to earn a fan in that player. You're going to earn respect with that player. They will probably never try that again. They're probably just a well-meaning joker who's trying to test the limits of the game to see what'll happen. And by you making what should happen, it's good. It's good. Just be ready for that. Be ready for that. The other type of player who's going to do this is just your straight-up toxic player. And when you shut them down with the town militia or the retired wizard, whoever's in town that can just snap them and take them out when they exhibit bad behavior, when they pick on the locals, they're going to get really hostile about it. They're going to argue with you about it. And they're always going to, that's the kind of person you don't want in your game. And, you should have, even as a brand new dungeon master, you may feel like you're lucky to have 3 or 2 people sitting at your table. But if one person, is just kind of a toxic player, someone who just always wants to do dastardly things and then argue when the consequences come about, I would really work quickly to get that character out of your group. Like, as in, don't invite them to the next session. And, I think this is something that blindsides a lot of newer players. They prepare this peaceful village and this obvious sort of like, oh, there's a dungeon in the side of the hill and people have been disappearing and they think they're being dragged off to the dungeon by goblins that sneak into the town at night. It's just kind of this, perfect kind of beginning kind of adventure. It's actually just a nice, solid, great idea. But then the players, they walk into the inn and they start talking crap to the barmaid. They flip a table over when they don't get quick service. It's that 1 or 2 sort of jackass players at the table, and it just throws the new DM for a loop. They don't know what to do. So as a new DM, just be prepared. Have the local law. Again, the knight is a pre-made stat block, as is the veteran, as is the guard. Have a posse ready. It doesn't have to happen in the moment. It can happen the next morning. They can wake up to a sword at their throat. Be prepared for somebody to do this, and have your consequences ready. Because I don't know. New DMs just pro tip right there. Guys, I've been thinking about this topic, this video, for a long time, and it's really impossible to do this topic in a satisfying way. I feel like I could make about 10 of these videos. I could do a whole course on this. So really just trying to throw some ideas out there for you newer DMs that you may not have heard before, or that I think aren't really hammered home on enough. I hope you've gotten a ton of use out of this video. I want to thank you guys once again for daring to put on the mantle of DM, for coming out of your shells, for taking a risk. Again, the world needs more dungeon masters. You guys really are doing a service to all the players out there that can't find a table to play at. And I'm just really so happy and excited for you. I hope your first game is way better than you expected. I hope it's great. You're gonna, one thing is that you're gonna have to get the bad out before you start to draw forth the good. You're gonna have some rough sessions, especially as maybe you're trying to get players together and you're putting together sort of a motley crew of players and they don't gel. There's going to be some rough seas here and there, and your first games are not going to be your best games. You might even have some awful games. But if you stick with this, there is so much enjoyment and fulfillment in running games of Dungeons and Dragons, and you're doing such a service for all the people out there that want to play. And also make sure you get to play too. Thanks for watching, guys.